What I tell landlords all the time over a 26-year career, don't go to court on principle on a security deposit case. Make a business decision based on dollars and cents, not to prove a point. Because we were talking before we got going here, guys, that you could have the same exact case that you're defending as a landlord on Monday in Jefferson County, different judge, with the same case in Douglas County on Wednesday, Boulder on Friday, and get three radically different results. These are very subjective cases. So when there's not a lot of money at stake, to me, it just isn't worth it. But when they're bigger balances, then that can really change the game.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We have a very important topic for landlords, and it's really talking about some changes in how security deposits are handled here in Colorado. And I have a great panel today to come discuss this. My name is Chris Lopez. I am the host of the Denver Real Estate Investing Podcast and also a local landlord. I'm joined by Brandon Scholten, who is also a landlord, but also the CEO and founder of Key Renter Denver. Good afternoon, Brandon.
Good afternoon.
We have David Mitchell, who is the Director of Operations with Key Renter on Brandon's team. Welcome to the webinar, David.
Thank you.
And last but not least is Wes Wolenweber, who is an attorney and mediator around town. Wes, glad you're on the podcast.
Hey, you did good with my name. Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I didn't go for the law firm name, so I hope I stayed in the safe zone on there.
You did.
But this webinar has been a couple months in the making in terms of like just trading emails, getting people's schedules aligned, and we've had some just really fascinating debate prep. I've had the privilege of talking to all three of the panelists here in depth. We have a lot of knowledge, so I want to jump into it, and I encourage people to ask any questions. So Brandon, why does this matter talking about security deposits here in late 2025?
Yeah, I mean, security deposits are pretty heavily regulated. As we say here, it rarely comes down to who's right about the damage. A lot of times it's other details like that, the documented condition of the property, both before and after. It's following timelines. It's, lease language. It's all of that. So, having been through many of these, like some. Obviously, a lot of most of them go off without any major issues. Some get contentious, and some go to court, and some are mediated. Some go all the way to a judge. So we've seen a little bit of everything. So hoping to share some of that knowledge today. So what you'll learn, what you can deduct, some tips around documentation, the timelines you got to stick to. We'll cover some of the gray areas. I think that'll be a good point for some story time and hearing how some of these shook out, and just some advice from Wes on legal language that can help protect you in these situations.
And on the note before we start it, this is an educational webinar. Gotta give the standard disclaimer. We are not giving legal advice, of course, just educating everyone out there and helping people be aware of the law, what's going around town, but always make sure you talk to your lawyer and reference your lease as well. Big shout out to the Key Renter here. They do portfolio health audits. This is something they started offering landlords about a year ago. So there's a lot of landlords who self-manage who are starting to transition over to professionally managed property managers to navigate these laws that are being passed. If you're interested or you already are with a manager and you want to see how things are going, plug in to Key Renter. They go through a 6-step process to give you a audit check on your portfolio, and it's very, very beneficial. So everything from understanding your goals to doing a market analysis to checking to see if you need a Denver rental license to reviewing utilities and then reviewing your properties and giving you a really good report at the end there. All right, so let's talk about understanding Colorado law and the timelines. Wes, you spend a lot of time mediating and working with people on this. So walk us through the high level of this.
Yeah, you bet. I've been around 26 years dealing with landlord-tenant stuff. And if you have, and I really appreciate the invite today being on, because I've got a little bit of a soapbox about what I'm seeing going on in litigation. I think we all know it's kind of open season on landlords with so much statutory change in Colorado in the last 3 or 4 years. But funny enough, with security deposits, I don't think it's really changed too much. We'll talk a little bit today about some changes I've seen that are a result of cases I've mediated. But under the statute that's been around for a number of years that we're going to talk about today, and by the way, I think your slides are fantastic with a lot of great info, but CRS 3812-103 is pretty much read the same way for a long time, and the timelines have been pretty clear for years, that a landlord has 30 days from surrender or acceptance of the rental unit to account for the deposit, or 60 days if the lease is clear on that. Brad and I were talking, I've seen a few weird ones over the years, like 45 days, but it's usually always either A, 30 or B, 60. And that in that time frame, the landlord's got to do an exact written statement, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along, of why the landlord is deducting anything from the deposit. And what I've learned over the years, guys, in litigation is that's a hard deadline, a hyper-technical deadline. If the landlord, for any reason, doesn't meet that 60-day deadline, let's say hypothetically her or his lease says they got 60 days to provide that security deposit accounting. If they don't get it done in that 60 days, even if they're a couple days late, then there's a real argument that they've blown that deadline. So what happens, based on what we're looking at on this slide, if you blow that deadline, is you have forfeited your right to withhold any money from the deposit. And we'll talk a little bit later how that could lead to treble damages under the Colorado case law that has interpreted the Security Deposit Act over the last couple decades. So those are your timelines that you got to really stay clear on. And I've been asked the question at some point, Wes, what do I do if I've got most of my damages accounted for, but maybe not all? And I'll say, well, meet that 60 or 30-day deadline and get a security deposit accounting out. And then if you got to supplement it, fine. But make sure you get the lion's share of it figured out, even if that means you're dealing with contractors that have got to get in quick to assess and estimate a particular, like say, bigger ticket piece of physical damage that you're going to deduct for. At least meet that deadline first and supplement later if you absolutely have to.
Can I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, sure.
We often get is there's that whole area of like, what if it's something that you can't just refinish a small part of hardwood floors or something like that. So what do you do with the gray, or how have you seen that shake out where it's like you can't really do the work without doing significantly more work? Can you kind of estimate what that would cost? And
yeah, I think the question is,
that?
can you estimate it and deduct based on that estimate? And I think you can, as long as you follow up with that estimate and get that work done. Because we're going to talk about two ways that tenants have won treble damage verdicts in Colorado in bench trials that I've seen, one jury trial. And a bad faith withholding of a deposit can lead to a problem. It's like if a landlord relies on an estimate, but then maybe never fixes that alleged damage, that could be problematic. So going back to what we're looking at there, missing the deadline. If a landlord misses, say their lease hypothetically gives him or her 60 days to account for the deposit, let's say they either just forget to do it or they're late, then the tenant sends a 7-day demand under Colorado Revised Statute 3812-103 for the return of the deposit. The only way to prevent treble damages at that point, under two very important Colorado Supreme Court cases, Young versus Michigan and Martinez versus Steinbaum, you just got to give the money back. That's your get out of jail card. You could always sue or countersue if somebody comes after you for damages you have, but it would be an offset to treble. So just to sum that up, if you've blown that deadline for any reason and you get a 7-day demand, you've got to give the deposit in full back in that 7 days to prevent treble damages. That's the first way tenants can get a treble damage award in Colorado. And later we'll talk about a bad faith withholding where you've counted for everything just fine, you've met the deadline, but the tenant is challenging your deductions. That's a much harder area for a tenant to prevail on treble, but we'll get into some cases I've seen on that later.
Does our audience fully understand too, just to clarify, when we say treble damages, it's thrown around a lot, but it's basically like whatever you withheld incorrectly, they're going to be awarded 3 times that amount back.
Exactly, 3 times. So just to recap that a little bit, if I'm your landlord, Brandon, you come after me and I've just failed to account for your deposit at all, or I'm late, by whatever number of days, and I have forfeited the deposit. You send me the 7-day demand. Let's say your deposit's $2,000, and I've blown that deadline. I don't give you the money back in the 7 days, and you sue me. I'm automatically in the hole based on those two cases, $6,000. And let's say Chris is your attorney. He's representing you on this. You could get your attorney's fees along with those treble or triple damages.
Okay, thanks.
So that can add up pretty fast then.
It really can in those situations. Yep.
Let's talk about normal wear and tear versus tenant damage. And Dave, I don't know if you got an insight from, a lot of stuff you do with Key Renter, but can you walk us through the overview about normal wear and tear versus tenant damage?
Yeah. Yeah, what I look at in just try and teach, at least, is I look at it in two different categories that I feel like it's helped me in the way of neglect or misuse, or the wear and tear would be like mechanical failure. So I don't know, a real life example would be just kind of like blinds, like a broken blind slat. That seems like that could fall into neglect or misuse. Whereas like the pull cord or something in the mechanism, if that's broken, might have a harder time proving that that is neglect or misuse. So those are two things that I would at least look at, try and get them into one of those two categories when you're trying to decide if it's a tenant damage or not.
One thing I might add here, sometimes we rely on our vendors on some of this of like, if we just don't know, like what, how normal is it that the handle gets ripped off a microwave? Is that someone really horsing around, or is that just like, that happens every so often? We'll often ask our vendors who like specifically service that kind of thing or would regularly see this, and a lot of times that opinion helps us. Like they're like, no, this is kind of common, we see this wear out, or they'll say like, no, it takes like more than likely someone really did something neglectful there. And
that definitely helps if we can have the vendor saying, no, this definitely seems like it was tenant caused damage. If they can put that on the invoice or whatever that looks like, having that to back it up, that's a big help too,
because that's kind of convincing to the tenant too often of like, maybe this isn't worth fighting, they got a professional opinion here.
Yeah.
What about, standard ones I hear, carpet and paint, right? Carpet, paint, and then holes in the wall from pictures. Is that always wear and tear, Wes, or can that sometimes be categorized under tenant damage? Because imagine,
That's a great question. And I have to say, as I answer it, this is my favorite slide in your presentation. I love the green versus pink because I've seen these issues litigated a lot where a judge, not often a jury, it's usually a bench trial where a judge is deciding normal wear and tear. So back in the day, the way that landlords got brought into these cases is either a landlord sued them in small claims, or bigger case in county court might even have an attorney, or landlord has a collection agency suing tenant, and tenant counterclaims in the collection trial with the security deposit claim, because I've seen it all from those angles. And over the years, I've seen trends, to answer Chris's question, with county court judges. When it's a much bigger deposit and you get to district court where cases are over $25,000, hard to know what the judge's trends are. But it used to be, I saw a real trend that like in leases where you've contracted for X amount of damage for missing drain pans, or X amount for carpeting, X amount for paint, judges would enforce that. But what I'm hearing, especially as a mediator in recent cases I've mediated, I think the landscape's changed with that. So these contracted rates that some landlords have in a lease for a certain particular amount of damage, judge might not just give you that because the lease is contracted for that. I think they're going to look much more at what David was just saying. So one of the things I learned in a recent case I mediated is that Denver County Court judges have been talking carpeting that's, over 4 years, they're going to start giving like what I'd call a diminution value for replacement. So say I'm your tenant and I really do damage that carpet well beyond normal wear and tear. The evidence at trial probably needs to focus around, when did the landlord purchase that carpet? What type of carpeting it is? What condition was the carpeting in? We're going to talk about move in, move out inspection reports here in a little bit. And I think judges really do look more at that now than a standard amount. And I think they've moved away from feeling like minor nail holes, things like that are beyond wear and tear. It's like, hey, everybody comes into a place, and landlord, you probably have 2-3-year-old paint, not going to make the tenant, repaint your unit. But conversely, if you've got pretty good evidence as a landlord that you painted and it's pretty recent, and the tenants come in, and during their lease term they don't fix those nail holes, picture frame marks, and touch up paint, that falls over on the pink side. To me, that's avoidable, negligent, abusive stuff that's damaged the paint. Or similarly, carpet. If you put marks in the carpet holes, I think you could be held accountable. So that was a long-winded way of saying it really needs to be damage that is beyond wear and tear. The other thing judges look at with wear and tear, there's an old case, Los Zapatistas, where some Hare Krishnas rented a chapter of the Hare Krishnas rented an old commercial space and burned a bunch of candles, caused a lot of damage to windows, window frames, and they got their deposit returned through a judicial award because the landlord should have understood how they were going to use the property. So I always say when I have this opportunity, think about who you're renting to, what the use is. If you're renting to a family of 3 kids and 3 dogs, wear and tear for that single family home rental is going to be viewed very differently than a higher end single family home with a family with no pets. So you just kind of got to think on top of what we see on that slide, who are you renting to and what does that lease tenancy look like in terms of the use of the property? They
would expect, if I have a duplex and the sides are exactly the same, remodeled all that, I rent one side to a single person, no pets, no cats, no dogs, and then rent the other side to a family with 3 kids and 3 dogs, you're saying I should have different expectations for what normal wear and tear is based off of that person's or family structure?
Exactly.
How does that not get into some form of discrimination?
Because you got 2 different situations that aren't necessarily apples to apples. So let's say Unit A on the duplex, no animals, smaller family. Unit B, you're not really holding them necessarily to do a different standard. You're just defining wear and tear based on how they're going to be using the property. So think about that. If Unit B on your duplex, they have 3 dogs, 3 kids, you're going to have more, you're going to have to define wear and tear. I'm not saying massively different than A. A has, say, a mom and dad, a kid that comes home from college once in a while, and that's it. And they have no pets, no animals of any kind. I'm just saying, to clarify, you got to look at wear and tear maybe a little bit different, especially as it might pertain to the yard, how maybe some scuff marks on the floor from animals, nails, things like that, if that makes sense. Fair housing is always incredibly important to me. So yeah, it wouldn't be a discriminatory issue between the two because you have a business reason to treat Unit B differently than Unit A and view wear and tear differently.
Okay.
And maybe where discrimination would come into play is if you said, I'm not going to rent to the family because of the higher standard of normal wear and tear or something.
Exactly.
What about some of the comments here? There are some comments about, fair housing. Does that apply? Does wear and tear apply to a service animal who is a dog?
I think it does. You've got 2 kinds of assistance animals in our world. I like to call them the 2 species, service dogs and the ever popular emotional support animal. While not a pet and while not subject to pet fees and all those things, because they are usually granted by a landlord as an accommodation for an individual with a disability, they still are held to the same standard as any other animal. If they cause damage above wear and tear, I strongly believe you can deduct for those damages. And on top of that, I advise all of my clients, many of whom are in affordable housing, to do assistance animal addendums if they don't already have an addendum to cover damage above wear and tear. It's a great question.
Could you talk a little bit about how we approach the like the carpet that was 3 years old when they moved in? It feels like they used it more than their year worth, but how are we usually navigating that?
Yeah, it's similar to what you were touching on, Wes, with a useful life of it. And so we have a lot of information on useful life and just broken down by carpet and paint, blinds, whatever it may be. And then we could go in and say, all right, this carpet looks excessively worn, damaged, soil from pets, whatever that looks like. And then we can have it backed up from the vendor saying that, yeah, this is what it is. And
Like
then at that
should
time,
be 10-year carpet.
yeah,
It was 3 years old, but they kind of
yeah,
fast tracked the wear and tear on it.
yeah, have discussions with the owner of when did you get it? Do you have receipts? And then kind of go off of that of like, well, this carpet should have lasted 5 years. It only lasted 3 years, and make up the difference there.
So I have a question. A few minutes ago, Wes, you were mentioning sometimes things go to small claims court, they go to mediation, or they go to trial. Is there like a rough ballpark for like the cost of those three things? Because I've learned over the years, as I'm in my 40s now, it's sometimes better be pragmatic than be right. And I know, hey, if we're talking $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 security deposit, that can quickly get eaten up by legal fees and all that. Like, anything comment on the fees and just when is it worth it, or any ballpark?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Let's take small claims first. Let's go with the hypothetical that a tenant sued a landlord in small claims court. Landlord under small claim rules can certainly lawyer up. Lawyer just has to give a certain notice of representation X number of days before trial. But say you spend a couple hours in front of a small claim magistrate, or even worse, the entire day, because the tenant's got all this evidence that he or she wants to put on. The fees on something like that could easily well exceed the security deposit. So I think a lot of landlord advocate attorneys, especially at Cheddar Souls or Muccio, which is where some of my background is, we advise landlords a lot of the times to settle these out if possible.
Yeah.
Don't go to court, because from a cost benefit analysis point to your question, it ain't worth it.
Or on some of these, you probably have like people just represent themselves. That's often what we do. Yeah, because it's
Absolutely.
again just like it's not worth the extra money to get it all right.
Right. And it's just if you got a pro se, meaning a plaintiff tenant with no attorney, and they sue you in county court where you're going to have even more attorney time, but you as the landlord lawyer up, yeah, you really need to talk to your attorney about what makes sense from a cost benefit analysis point of view. And what I tell landlords all the time over a 26-year career, don't go to court on principle on a security deposit case. Make a business decision based on dollars and cents, not to prove a point. Because we were talking before we got going here, guys, that you could have the same exact case that you're defending as a landlord on Monday in Jefferson County, different judge with the same case in Douglas County on Wednesday, Boulder on Friday, and get three radically different results. These are very subjective cases. So when there's not a lot of money at stake, to me, it just isn't worth it. But when they're bigger balances, then that can really change the game.
And I thought it was interesting. You were saying on a lot of these where there isn't often times where the judge is not like going overwhelmingly one direction or the other with who's losing and winning. He's like, yeah, okay, I'll give you these damages. Those seem like they were withheld and shouldn't have been, but this stuff seemed legitimate. So they'll kind of like settle it up like that. And in a lot of those cases, they're not awarding attorney's fees either way. It's like you both pay your own way.
Yeah, let's say you do have a case where tenant has counsel, landlord has counsel, and you go to a full-scale trial. I remember when I used to try a lot of these, I went up to the bench because we had the two attorneys had an argument, and I saw the judge with the big legal pad there laying down the paper, and landlord written on the left, tenant on the right, exactly what I do if I was a judge, and just going down that list. All right, I think landlord's proven that she had a valid basis to withhold for the carpeting, but on some other physical item, I'm giving that to the tenant. We'll talk later about whether they would treble it. And I think that's how a lot of judges do it from a mechanical point of view. Who can prove the deduction? Who can prove the deduction wasn't just? And then you get to the end of that, let's say it was a $4,000 deposit, and the tenant maybe proves $1,500 of that, didn't get any trouble because he couldn't convince the judge it was a willful and wrongful withholding. Judge could say, hey, neither of you are a prevailing party, and not give attorney's fees. And that's what's tough about those cases. Judges have a lot of discretion to determine who really won this case, who substantially prevailed, who should get fees. And I have a bias getting that I'm old, getting older. I've just seen judges getting more wishy-washy about that over the years in landlord-tenant cases and not awarding either side fees when one side really it has won. So there's always that risk as a landlord. Are you going to get your fees back even if you defeat this case? Like if you keep the deposit amount down that the tenant gets back, say they're suing you for $5,000, they only get $1,000. I don't know if you'll get your fees, saying, well, I'm the prevailing party because you were going for $5,000, I kept you to $1,000. Or a judge could say, well, you breached the lease, I'm going to give the tenant those fees. To sum that up, it's risky. You don't know what a judge is going to do or not do when it comes to attorney's fees on these landlord tenant and security deposit cases.
And we've seen interest awarded too. I don't know if you've seen that.
What do you mean, David?
Just like a judge would say, okay, I'm going to award the tenant this amount, and I'm going to say that you owe 8% interest since the tenant should have gotten the security deposit back. And
Yeah, and anytime you win a case as a plaintiff in Colorado in a civil case, you do get statutory post-judgment interest. So you bring up a great point. So in a landlord-tenant case, especially a deposit, there will be post-judgment interest awarded to a tenant, and it's a high rate. 8% doesn't sound high, but it's compounded annually based on the statute's language. So that can really add up on a little bit bigger award. So yeah, that's a good point.
I want to talk about the changes going to affect January 1, right? There's a couple laws that are going into, I guess, into force on the January 1. Wes, can you highlight some of these changes to security deposit that go into effect January 1, 2026?
Sure. Under that House Bill 1249, let's just look at that first bullet point. It's going to change. It's actually going to throw into statute that we've been talking about a definition of normal wear and tear, and expand it to basically say that uncleanliness that does not really change the unit or render the unit substantially less clean is normal wear and tear. It's like, just kind of run-of-the-mill untidiness that isn't that much different than if you look at the before condition before the tenants moved in. That's going to be in that statute.
So that would kind of override any of this language of like, we automatically in our lease just say it's $400 cleaning fee.
Exactly.
Taken off the top.
I'm so glad you asked that. Precisely. That's exactly what it's going to override.
Out there like that. That was very common.
Yeah, the last case I mediated, which was a conflict over a very expensive residential condo rental, the landlord had that type of language in several places under the security deposit section of the lease. And as they got to court, this kind of language that starts January 1st, to your point, would totally override that. And then looking at that third bullet point, landlords must provide upon request documentation within 14 days to justify any retained deposit. That actually blew my mind a little bit. That's a pretty substantial change.
How did it blow, like in what aspect did it blow your mind?
Well, you would think that, landlords would always have that kind of documentation before they withhold from a deposit. But to say that they got to turn around and give it within 14 days of doing a SOTA, security deposit accounting, that just kind of surprised me a little bit.
Is it 14 days of that, or is that like upon request, then it would
I think
start
if I understand that language, it's 14 days upon request.
Okay.
And I bet it's 14 days from the date of the request. And then,
so I wonder how that would apply to something like if you needed to resod a yard, but it's winter or something like that. If maybe you could do like get an estimate and a written notice that it couldn't be done yet or something.
Right. That with a lot of the landlord statutory changes we've seen, especially to warrant habitability, my concern is how does the landlord jump into action that fast? That's why it surprises me, to answer your earlier question, Chris. It just doesn't seem equitable to me. So I think Brandon hit the nail on the head. To jump into that action that fast, you better get some estimates and then circle back and redocument it. I don't know how else you could do it. And then that fourth bullet point, we're looking at what we've been talking about for the last several minutes here, professional carpet cleaning fees, things you talked about that are these contracted rates that I've been talking about in leases. Really need to have your landlord counsel review those because they may not be as enforceable as they used to be under this new bill. And then I love that last bullet point, update your lease language and your move out checklists and your deduction policies to comply with some of these changes. That part I don't think will be too hard to do. You just, as somebody that owns property, those who fee manage for owners, just re-review with counsel if everything's looking the way it should. That doesn't give me too much heartburn. So these aren't huge changes like I've seen to some of the other aspects of landlord-tenant statutes, but they're there, and just got to kind of be ready for them.
Here's a really interesting question from the chat here. Stephen asked, if you have dealt with Section 8, do you ever see Section 8 Housing Authority or HUD hold a tenant accountable for damage to the property? I'll kind of start with you. I mean, you guys are PMs.
My sense on that, I think the answer would be Section 8 and HUD is not in a position to hold anyone accountable for that. That's not their role in the situation. You sign a contract with the tenant, you sign a lease with the tenant, and you also sign a contract with HUD, but that relates to the payment of the rent, not. So I think everything would still go back to like there's a lease in place with the tenant and there's.
Totally on point. Yeah, you're dead on accurate, because that's kind of my world too with affordable housing. So you have that triangular contractual relationship. Landlord, you're in a HAP contract with the housing authority who's issued a choice voucher for Section 8. Tenant has that voucher. Then the tenant's in a lease with you, and the lease would govern the return of the security deposit. And the housing authority who's administrating the HUD money, to your point, Brandon, has no responsibility or role with that. That's just not part of their contract. So good job. That was a great answer. And a great question.
So, got a pro tip here. I'm going to turn this over to you, Brandon, because you put this in here, or I should say your team put this in here. What's the pro tip?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard one. I feel like I can often be sympathetic with stuff breaks in my own house that I'm like, yeah, it seems bizarre. I wouldn't have anticipated having to fix that. I certainly don't think I abused the house in any way. So yeah, it's just, would this have happened from careful everyday use? There's a million ways to interpret that, but I think it's a good thing to just reflect on, and to try to be fair as we navigate these. I don't know. Would you add anything, David?
I think that's good. I think that kind of along the lines of what we've been talking about with mediation and being pragmatic, you just don't know either. I use the example a lot of, it was the first time that I went to court to defend a deposit. One of the things, it was a brand new build. I think the refrigerator was, it was a brand new Bosch multi-$1,000 refrigerator. By the time they moved out, there's a fist-sized dent in the refrigerator. We had it repaired in the way of just a new skin over the stainless steel skin over it, and I think it was just $400 to $700, something like that. Not a huge expense, not like a whole new door. And we get there, and the tenant said, "Well, that was damaged because of when you open one cabinet, and then if you try and open the fridge at the same time, the cabinet bumped into the fridge and it dented at that." So they were trying to say that it was just a poor design. So, okay, our defense is either way, like it was dented while you were there. I feel like this is reasonable to put on you to repair it. The judge ended up saying his reason, he awarded the tenant. He said, no, you don't have to pay. And his reasoning is that there's not a single fridge in any rental house that at one point doesn't become dented. And that was his reasoning for saying that, no, the tenant doesn't.
How big was this dent?
It was about the size of a fist.
I mean, like it was legitimate, like fist size.
Yeah. And we had here's before, it's a new fridge, here's after, this is what it looks like. That was the reasoning. But all that to say, I mean, I've seen many things that just kind of scratch my head at. It's like, you just don't really know how it's going to go. And some things like that too, I think I would be willing to fight again, but
yeah, just because it went that way one time doesn't mean like, oh, then forever don't charge for dents and appliances.
Yeah.
I think it's like, well, that feels like not the outcome every time. So
no, I'd have to agree, and that was my point. You just can't be clairvoyant what a judge will do. And when I talk about mediation, guys, you have to be careful because everything said in a mediation is confidential. But I can give examples because you don't have any idea who was involved. And so one of the more recent ones I had, we talked about this very thing, and I asked that question, like, this thing that you're deducting for, isn't that just kind of the result of everyday use? So I think it's a pretty good barometer to use when you're going through that accounting process.
I don't think I've ever dented a fridge in my own home, so that would be maybe one where I'd err on the side of that. That feels excessive.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, I've
agree.
had doors and the cabinets mix up. I've never, left a fist-sized dent in either one.
Yeah.
I want to look back because some comments came in when we were talking about Section 8 here. Someone else asked, if the Section 8 tenant damages a property, aren't they in jeopardy of losing their voucher? And this is followed by another comment. This would be in case where they've been in violation of their housing authority agreement and HUD regulations. So I think those two are intertwined. Because if a Section 8 tenant destroys the house, can they lose their Section 8 housing voucher?
Why don't you take this one?
The answer is yes. I have housing authority clients. It's not the norm. I don't think a tenant that has a choice voucher through Section 8 who causes some damage to a property is necessarily in jeopardy of losing the voucher. But in cases where there's pretty significant damage, my housing authorities have done what they call terminating that subsidy. Now, they have to grant a hearing. It usually happens, to answer this listener's question, it usually happens in the context where that tenant is going to port from one county to another, and they're taking that voucher in, and there's some concern as the housing authority that you're not giving the public notice that you've got a tenant that caused a lot of damage. So this was a narrow context that I'm speaking to where we had a tenant cause thousands of dollars of damage that led to a lawsuit. Typically housing authorities don't sue lower income tenants for damage, but this was so extreme they did. So they terminated the subsidy and made the public aware of it. But to sum that up, I think it's got to be pretty extreme damage before a housing authority would take the risk of terminating the voucher, which is subject to an internal appeals process. And Colorado Legal Services in those situations will often get involved and try to fight it and keep the subsidy or the voucher in place.
So you're saying, just way beyond the line of normal wear and tear,
Yes.
like the tenant goes out of their way to just, damage the property on purpose.
Yeah.
Okay.
This particular tenant, just to add a little detail, was concerned that there was mold in the house due to a little bit of a water leak, and decided to do destructive testing with a sledgehammer on his home, and just took a sledgehammer to the drywall in the basement, causing $1,000 of drywall structural damage. I mean, it was pretty radical situation.
Did you find mold, though?
No, that's the beauty of it. And I've seen residents who have found mold in those situations, but not in this particular one. Yeah. So the housing authority did terminate the voucher, and that person couldn't get a new voucher from that particular housing authority. I learned later they try to get one from another housing authority in a different jurisdiction, but that's going to be problematic because word travels on those kind of issues.
Okay. So let's talk about what landlords get wrong. I don't know who wants to kind of go through this slide first, but just kind of some best practices and, how do you set yourself up for success?
I can touch on it. I think we're just trying to highlight some of the things that we've already touched on, but if you're sloppy with your documentation, just kind of moving quickly, not bothering to do a move-in checklist, make sure you have photos, kind of be organized with all this. You're going to have a really weak case when the time comes to defend that. I think Wes, hopefully everybody on this call is super clear that these deadlines are a big deal. You miss those and it basically throw out everything else we said. You're no longer entitled to the same legal rights and that kind of thing. So, and just to highlight, it's 30 days if the lease doesn't speak to the timeline. And then Colorado has always had this provision that if you specify a different timeline, it can be up to 60 days. So a lot of standard lease language will have that 60 days. If you're not following those 10 timelines, again, we run into this a lot where we're waiting on some vendor who's kind of slow to get back to us, and we're waiting for one more invoice to come in to finalize it and close it out. And yeah, sometimes we just can't get it in time and it's more important to hit the deadline than to get that last thing in there. So yeah. Also, like, yeah, we've just seen issues with general cleaning, miscellaneous damage, things like that is not nearly as likely to, I think, hold up than if you can be really specific of what was wrong and what needed to be repaired. Maybe until this new law, I don't think there's ever been anything like statutory that highlights a need for a certain type of invoice or that the work has to be completed. I think it's long been best practice that you shouldn't withhold for things where you didn't actually do the work. But yeah, would you add anything?
No, I really agree with that. Years ago when I was a young lawyer, and funny enough, I was at Hopkins Cheddar as they were kind of building, a big law firm practice, and they were supportive of me suing a really bad landlord at the time. And his whole argument in the case is he had resodded the whole backyard, got estimates for it, but never fixed it, and in fact didn't fix any of the damage in the property and then re-rented it to a new family. And the argument his insurance defense attorney made in that case is, but it's still damage. Whether you fixed it or not, it's still damage. It's deductible from the deposit. And a judge in that case said, absolutely no way. And I think that's kind of been the trend. But in my life over the years, what I see, the 5 things where landlords go wrong the most, you pretty much nailed 3 out of the 5, Brandon. Just not getting that accounting done in time, as we've talked a lot about, kind of beating that to death. But you've got to comply with that or you forfeit the deposit. Second, landlords who do not document those move-in conditions well enough. As fate would normally have it, the tenants document the move-out conditions pretty good. So a judge has to compare and contrast move-in versus move-out. And if you're just not very documented on the move-in, you've really started off on the wrong footing. And I mediated a case earlier this year that was in Boulder, very large college, university deposit. Sometimes Boulder leases have huge deposits. And the judge ruled in favor of the tenants on this case on a motion that the landlord had missed the deadline. Third thing landlords do wrong that goes to that emotional or informal communication. The landlord had texted all of her reasons and emailed, combination of the two, for withholding the deposit. And the argument the tenants made is, well, we don't even understand what you're really withholding for. So you had a major issue of whether the landlord had given an exact statement based on the language of 38-12-103, and the judge ruled that she hadn't, and therefore missed that deadline. Forfeiting the deposit was automatically in the hole for Treble. So they were trying to settle the case since she had triple damages already hanging out there. So that's the 4th thing. And the 5th thing landlords do wrong is overreach. They withhold for a big ticket item. If it kind of appears to a judge, then a landlord's trying to remodel some of the unit for things that are pretty much wear and tear, like carpeting that is pretty old, paint that's been around a while, and they're trying to use the deposit for that. That even if that's really not the case, but it kind of looks that way, that's the 5th mistake where landlords get it wrong.
So going back to this 4th bullet point here, you're saying text and email do not count as a written means of communication to the tenant?
Not necessarily, because it's a great question. I'm not necessarily saying that, because the Security Deposit Act doesn't specify. It just says written statement. So I do think an email or text could cut it, and that was certainly the argument in that case. But the standard, I think, is whether the tenant understands what you're deducting for. So to Brandon's point earlier about best practices, I would not do it in the body of an email. I would stay true to the old school itemization format. Highly recommend it. Not that hard to do, and it's a lot better to be safe than sorry and then have any question marks over whether the tenant not understanding what you were actually deducting for.
Yeah, there's a lot of templates out there you can find online and that kind of thing. But basically, it's typically just a one-pager that's kind of, got some line items, sort of a ledger style. Mm-hmm. Here's what we ended up with that we're refunding. But I think we've, for a long time, included a bunch of receipts to show them real vendors that did this work.
Yeah. One thing that's not necessarily getting wrong, but just you don't know what a county court will do wherever you're at in the state. It's for landlords who self-manage and they withhold and they get sued, or they're going for damages and they try to charge an hourly rate for their time fixing things. I've noticed it over many years, colleagues of mine who manage their own stuff and they go to court. You still know if the judge will give you your time and labor, your T&M, for handling your own repair work. Some judges will, some won't.
You're almost better off to have a third party do it, and then you have this clean documentation.
Precisely, yeah.
A couple of really good questions here in the chat. What are your thoughts on doing periodic inspections? For example, on a 12-month lease, doing inspection at 3 months, 10 months to help document wear and tear and damage. What are you guys' thoughts about periodic inspections to help document everything?
I saw they finished that question with you're almost providing the resident ways to maintain more of their deposit. So the idea would be you're almost like helping them. I don't know. David, what do you think? I guess I'd say one thing here is just you're kind of towing a line between, at some point the resident may just feel like you're kind of invading their privacy, and just they don't like it, so it may just make it harder to renew the tenant and that kind of thing. But
yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing unless it does cross a line like that. But then I think that you may also want to be cautious about that in the inspection, depending on how detailed you are at reviewing that. There could be something in there and you see it and just don't do anything about it. It could open the door for liability for you, I guess is what I'm trying to explain. Is if there's something in there, there's a dispute later on, you can go back to that inspection and say, hey, you knew about this, but you didn't do anything about it. There's that risk in that too.
Yeah, it feels like the tenant could easily get the idea that you're communicating to them, hey, just fix this one thing and you'll get your full security deposit back. And like, you got to be careful that you've, created that expectation.
You got anything to add on that?
No, those 2 points you kind of like were reading in my mind. I think that's the downside to that approach, is exactly that.
I had some notes on here from an earlier conversation I was trying to pull up, but I will reference that back later so I don't get distracted. Random question here. We always get a few of these, right? We got lawyers and property managers on here. What can I do if I find out from neighbors that my tenant has unauthorized pets or more pets than they claimed or paid on their deposits?
And it looks like they said had unauthorized. So we're talking they've already, I think the question is they've already moved out, and now after the fact you're getting knowledge that they had pets. What do you think?
I think if you can support it, if you can get some pictures from your neighbor, and then the neighbor is open to potentially acting as a witness if it needs to go that far.
Would this be like you're trying to evict the tenant for these reasons, or they've already moved out and now, I guess, Wes, what would your opinion be on like the lease having built in things like if you have an unauthorized pet, it's a $50 per day charge or something like that? Like, is there room after the fact to go withhold things like that from the deposit?
That's a great question. I think there might be. Again, it could depend on the county court you're in, the judge, but I think you might. And if the nature of that question, let's change it and say it's currently, like you're a landlord, your neighbor's giving you a heads up that your current tenants might have an animal and they know you and you don't think you allow pets, then I think you give like a 24-hour notice or whatever your lease requires to go inspect and start teeing up a demand for compliance and get it documented really quickly.
And if we're talking about security deposit here, if there's damage, whether or not it was an authorized pet or an unauthorized pet, I think that's pretty black and white. You can still withhold. It doesn't, even if like they weren't supposed to have pets, but they had pets that caused damage, you can still.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we'll do some more Q&A here, but I want to give two shout outs here. Again, we're going to talk about Key Renter's portfolio health audit. If you're interested in getting your portfolio reviewed, make sure you do reach out to Key Renter. And on that note, I think it was just a few weeks ago, we did a property walk, and it was actually turning a property that Key Renter was turning right after a tenant had vacated the property, actually go through with the property management, say, hey, here's how we are interpreting things like we've been talking about. We do have some of that property walk put up on YouTube now. I don't know if I don't think we put a link in the slide deck, but we will share those links with people because we got great feedback during the property walk. And then it is also a great way to go out there and just see how a professional property manager reviews it. So if you want those videos, I would say email us or drop them in the chat here, and some of the key renter team will actually send you those. And we are doing some periodic property walks as well, because one of the best ways to see this is come do property walks and also do some networking. Now, Wes, a question I have for you. When should a landlord connect with you, potentially engaging you as their attorney in, a dispute or a potential dispute with their tenants around security deposit or other matters? Like, where do you fit into the process?
Well, I kind of have a unique pipeline where if it's starting to head toward litigation, I get a lot of referrals that way. I'll change the question just a tiny bit. When should a landlord get counsel involved? If you get a 7-day demand letter from a tenant on a security deposit and you got any questions whether you should give some more back or have you accounted properly, at that stage, immediately get somebody like me involved, because it's not expensive just to look over your accounting, look at your itemizations, maybe even have a lawyer respond to the 7-day demand letter. So in a security deposit case, Chris, right when you get that 7-day demand. Sometimes though, my clients have never got the 7-day demand. Like the tenant says they mailed it, they're not aware of it, and a summons shows up on the door. Second you get a summons and you've been served with a lawsuit, reach out to counsel right away. On bigger cases, you may need to trigger your insurance coverage, but you don't want to delay. In county court, there'll be a set court date. District court, you got 21 days. So you want to get somebody on the horn really quickly. And not just think, well, it's just a security deposit case. What a pain in the butt. I'll deal with it later. You've got to deal with it then. Wrap your mind around it, that I'm in a dispute now and I better get some help. Great. That answer your question?
It does.
Enough? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Just some questions in the chat box here. How much does the health audit cost? It's free. Hey, key runner does that, to build relationships, and they want to win people's business over as well. So it's free. You can scan the QR code, and we'll send out a link later. And we did drop the link in the chat box here for the next property walk. We'll email everything out as well, since I know things get lost in the chat sometimes. Another question here. What are your thoughts about providing light bulb changes, HVAC filter changes, to get an idea of how the property is being maintained for budget planning on the turn of the unit? So I'm not sure they're saying they're doing that say halfway through the lease or
maybe
at
it's
the
like
end.
a follow-up to the question about the periodic inspections.
Yeah, so I think, hey, let's just say it's a 12-month lease. I'm coming at 6 months to, hey, I got to change the filter, just do some very basic maintenance like that, and also as a way to help keep eyes on the property.
I think it's better than just saying, hey, I'm coming to check the place out, right? Like it kind of it's a low friction way to be like, hey, I'm going to pop in, change the furnace filter. If that is something that you're not requiring of the tenant and you're like, hey, I'll just handle that, I think that's a good in if you're able to navigate that, cordially with the tenant and just make sure they're taking care of things. In general, I think the more there's probably just they're going to tidy it up for you. If there's something that they know they should have dealt with, they're going to make sure it's done before you get there. So it could be a good way to kind of keep your tenant on track a little bit. I don't know about light bulbs, because then you're kind of setting this precedent that you're the one who changes the light bulbs. So that's just going to be an added expense for you. I guess same with the filter, but maybe light bulbs could add up a little bit more than that.
I own my primary residence, and I know when I was a tenant, I have a hard enough time changing my own filter in my house on the regular basis. When I was a tenant, I certainly was not doing that maintenance and I can't remember if the landlord said I should or should not, but I can,
You weren't doing it.
I wasn't doing it, right? I was a 25-year-old single guy. I didn't care, right? Yeah. That was not a priority for me at all. So one more thing, and we did drop the link on here. We actually do have our next property walk schedule. I forgot we put a time and date on there. So we're actually doing it Tuesday, November 11th at 10 a.m. I don't think you guys nailed down a property.
These are always
yet,
hard
right?
for us because we gotta.
Depends on the turn time.
Yeah, like so you have to sign up an RSVP and then you'll get the address a couple days out. Because we're trying to figure out one that'll work well with like the tenants out right before we're gonna walk it, but it gives us enough time to make sure it's ready for us and all that.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a great
So
thing.
location TBD.
Yes,
That's what
which makes sense, right? You got to see what's turning on there. We have about 5 minutes left, gentlemen. I know there's a lot of just knowledge we have at the table. What other like best practice can you share, Wes, or stories that maybe popped in your mind when you have a chance to share while we were talking last hour?
Ooh, good question. So I'd mentioned, there's two ways that tenants can get these treble damage awards. The second way, which we've touched on quite a bit, is just a scenario where you've withheld from the deposit for amounts that a judge or a jury determine are really overreaching. That standard is bad faith, because the tenant has two elements that they got to prove in a case like that. They got to prove it was a willful withholding and a wrongful. And there are a couple old cases out there that define wrongful to be bad faith. How subjective. You mentioned, Brandon, this stuff's just so subjective, and it really is. One person's bad faith version of that is another person's version of that. I think you had every right to withhold it. But some stories around that was the one I shared where landlord went out and got an estimate for a bunch of sod and withheld the entire, which was a pretty large single-family home deposit at the time, withheld the entire deposit based on that sod, never sodded the yard. And why was that a big deal in that case? Well, his tenants were both journalists. One was an investigative reporter. I'm not sure I, as a landlord, would want to tangle with somebody who was going to document that scenario as well as she did. She's out there with her Channel 9 camera videotaping the new tenants moving in with 3 dogs, no sod. And to my point earlier, that landlord allowed 3 German Shepherd dogs in an older home that didn't have great grass in the backyard to begin with. It was pretty spotty, and then withheld the whole deposit for that, plus charged them a bunch of other things. But Chris, in that case, it was amplified by the fact that the boiler went out and got ragtagged by Excel. Maybe it was public service back then, made the landlord look bad. So I've only seen trouble in that second scenario, to your point earlier, Brandon, before we started the show, that we don't see it happen that often. When you just got a landlord that's making mistakes all the way through the tenancy and then gets to the goal line and withholds for things that he or she doesn't fix. So those are some of the more egregious things that most people wouldn't even cross their minds.
And we've never seen a judge award treble on something we were involved with. So.
No, we haven't. And I actually heard a judge say this just a few days ago, even to a tenant. Pre-trial or anything, and they're saying you need to go to mediation first. But he made a point to say, treble damages are very rarely rewarded in my court. And I'm wondering if that was him just kind of signaling, or at least recognizing the free tenant attorneys that are advertised everywhere when you go downtown. It's like maybe that's clogging up the system a little bit. But
what county was that in?
This was Denver.
Okay, good. That's good to know. So in Denver, you're there at a pretrial. Denver County judge isn't going to set a trial till you've gone to mandatory mediation. It was telegraphing to this tenant that it's just rare that this court, have awarded treble. And that's certainly been your experience, Brandon. So I think that should be comforting to our audience. The exposure for treble, in my mind, based on what you're saying, what I've been saying, isn't that great unless you're in that burst scenario where you just didn't get your accounting done properly and you've arguably forfeited the deposit and didn't return it after 7 days. But to your point earlier, Chris, then that begs the question on these cases, are they cost beneficial to fight? Yeah. Can you get them settled? At mediation, where I have bigger ones, they usually settle. We have these discussions in what we call caucus with each party, and I talk about the risk analysis. And I'll say exactly what you said the judge just said. Like, treble, I get why you think this was, too big of a withholding from your deposit and that the landlord did this or that. But I'll say, Miss Tenant, to get treble, you've got a pretty big burden. So you could go through the whole trial and get some kind of award, but then you might not get your attorney's fees back. So as a mediator, I just talk them through that cost benefit analysis and how it might shake out, and nobody wins but the lawyers that are getting paid, if they're getting paid. I think the tenant on that case, the attorney took it on a percentage on a contingent fee, so they were willing to kind of roll the dice, but the landlord's paying by the hour. And she felt very vindicated. So yeah, these cases need to settle. But at the end of the day, what troubles me with security deposits is really what it comes down to is documentation. I've tried a lot of different kind of cases in my 26 years. And documentation always, in my mind, wins the day for the landlord. So if you document the move-in conditions well, and you've got good receipts, like you mentioned in the one really cool slide that you had there, that you're documenting the before and after, you've got good receipts that back up what you deducted for. In this new climate where you may have to get estimates till you can really make the repair, if you've got good estimates, I think you're going to be in great shape. But if you got a smaller deposit, and even if you've done a great job with all of that, and you get hit with the 7-day demand and then a small claim suit or something, still probably better to settle them than then spend a bunch of money on fees. But ultimately, you just have to look at the dollar amounts.
I maybe talked about this earlier, but for us, a lot of these, it's like we might get a 7-day demand, or often it's not. Like the tenant just reaches out and says, like, this doesn't seem fair. That was like that when I moved in, or something. And so we often, it's not a formal mediation, but we just like, we'll talk about it and review it and maybe say like, yeah, I can see your point. Like we're willing to, refund half of that or something. So a lot of them get almost like formally kind of resolved, or informally get resolved, like before it ever gets
well, that brings up a good point. I mean, not just in landlord-tenant, but just any type of relation. If there's an issue, just pick up the phone or write an email or whatever. It's like, just communicate back and try to be practical and resolve it, right? I mean, we deal with this in business as well, and all sorts of stuff. It's just like, use common sense, everyone, both sides.
Yeah, but I really appreciate you bringing that up, because I feel like all of a sudden we've moved in an era where people aren't picking up the phone. And I think what you just said, a lot of the listeners should really latch onto. If you've got a little dispute over the deposit after, talk to the tenant. Do you get a lot of them ironed out that way?
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. I think that's one of the most valuable things we've talked about today. Try to resolve it with them and move on.
Cool. Yeah. Most people have, I think, good common sense out there, right? And most people are good people.
Yeah.
Well, hey, we are a couple minutes past the hour, so I'm going to be respectful of your guys' time and also people on the webinar. I know we have a few questions on here that we cannot get to. They were pretty technical questions. So I think based on the interest, demand, the amazing discussion, we should do some type of repeat as well on this, and maybe move on to some different topics, because I know this isn't the only law going in effect January 1 and some changes. Brandon, David, Wes, thank you gentlemen so much for taking your time and driving down the studio. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Our pleasure.
All right, everyone out there, hopefully you learned from this. Make sure you do sign up for these property walks and stay plugged into our educational resources. Just know what's going on, and when you need to find a PM or a lawyer, some great resources to go out there and connect with. So thank you everyone for joining us today.